Hi there, everyone. I hope you're doing well today. This video is going to be introducing what's called the fine-tuning argument for God's existence. So we're going to start out by talking about what teleological arguments are and how they're different than other kinds of arguments for God's existence. That'll then lead into some historical precedents to our fine-tuning argument by looking at arguments from analogy and this history of design arguments. That'll then lead us into a discussion of abductive reasoning as an alternative, which will then lead into this surprising observation of supposed fine-tuning within our universe, which will then lead us into actually introducing and explaining the overall argument known as the fine-tuning argument. Let's first talk about, what are teleological arguments? Broadly speaking, we can distinguish four families of arguments for God's existence. There are ontological arguments, moral arguments, cosmological arguments, and teleological or design arguments. All of these arguments have the same conclusion, that God exists. So what distinguishes them? If they're all arguing for the same conclusion, what makes them different kinds of arguments? Well, it's the premises. It's the kind of evidence that they try to use to establish God's existence. Ontological arguments claim that the idea of God is by itself enough to prove that there must be a God in reality, not just in our idea. Moral arguments claim that we are all aware that there is a moral law. There are certain things that are right or wrong. There's moral laws that we ought to follow. And then the claim is that, where does that moral law come from? There needs to be a lawmaker. And that lawmaker for morality would have to be God, according to this argument. Cosmological arguments claim that, we all know that we live in this physical universe. We know that it exists. But why does it exist rather than nothing? Or why did it begin to exist? It couldn't have popped into existence from nowhere. And so cosmological arguments claim that the mere fact that the universe or cosmos exists is itself evidence that there is a God, because we need God to explain how the universe began to exist, what created the universe. Teleological arguments claim that when we look at the kind of universe that exists, we notice that there seems to be design within the universe. Either the universe itself appears to have design, or maybe parts or elements of nature seem to have design. And so the fact that we see apparent design within the universe is supposed to be taken as evidence for God's existence. So let's talk about some earlier versions of teleological arguments that eventually led to the development of the fine-tuning argument. All right, so to understand some of these historical precedents, we need to understand argument from analogy. So an argument from analogy is you start out by making an analogy. You say that, A is similar to B, in some respects are. So the car I'm thinking about buying is similar to Robin's car in that both of them have the same make and model. They're both Honda Civics. Robin's car has been pretty reliable for her, and so probably this car that I'm thinking about buying, since it's so similar to Robin's, will probably be reliable for me as well. This is the idea of an argument from analogy. Now, classically, these design arguments, these teleological arguments, have often been reconstructed as this kind of argument from analogy, resting on a comparison between the universe we live in and a human artifact or a machine. The idea here is when you look at the universe, it seems to be rather similar to a machine, like a car or a watch or a computer. It has all these complex parts all working together. And the idea is, machines, they were created by an intelligent designer. That's where all this complexity came from, for instance. Since we have similar effects, we probably have similar causes. So the universe probably has a similar cause, namely an intelligent designer as well. And this would be God. Now, some of the difficulties with this argument often focus on premise one and saying that the analogy is not particularly strong. When you look at the universe as a whole, and when you look at a machine or nature, you actually notice quite a few differences between them as well. So the universe, for instance, seems to be self-sustaining. There's like the conservation of energy. All right, you never get more or less energy. You don't need to put new energy into the universe to keep it running, to keep it going. But machines, they are not self-sustaining. So for instance, your car, you need to keep putting gas in it, keep putting oil in it, keep having a mechanic come and fix things up. It is not self-sustaining. Similarly, many of the things in nature seem to be living. The universe is not living. Another problem with this is that there seem to be counter-analogies. The universe is also similar to natural things like a plant or an oak tree. And what does an oak tree come from? It comes from an acorn. So a lot of the classic criticisms of this kind of design argument come from David Hume, pretty well-known, historically established criticisms. Now, in light of those criticisms, this led to an updated version of the design argument, a very famous version of it coming from someone named William Paley. His focus was on organisms, and he didn't want to make just any comparison between organisms and machines. He wanted to say there's a very particular similarity feature that they share in common, and that feature is itself what is evidence of God's existence. It's not the similarity between these two things, but rather the fact that both machines and organisms, these elements of the natural world, are what we can call teleological systems. What a teleological system is a system of parts that are arranged in such a way that they're able to achieve some purpose or function. So the idea here is take a look at a car. All of the parts are arranged together in a system. You have the engine, you have the wheels, you have the axles, you have the pistons, you have the steering wheel. All of these are arranged in exactly the right way so as to allow the car to drive, to get you from point A to point B. That's what makes it a teleological system. And if those parts were not arranged in the order that they are, so for instance, if the axle was not actually connected to the wheel, then the car would not be able to achieve its function. Similarly, take the human heart. The human heart seems to have a function, namely pumping blood. It has a number of parts, all the chambers, etc., and all those parts need to be arranged in exactly the way that they are in order to achieve its function. Or the human eye. It has a lens, it has a retina, has cones and rods, and all those parts are in exactly the right place and arranged in the right kind of order so as to form a system that is able to perform the function of seeing. We can talk about plants and photosynthesis, etc., but the idea is when we look at natural living things in the world, they seem to be teleological systems. And now the claim of Paley's design argument is that teleological systems can only be produced by an intelligent designer. Those parts can't get arranged in that precise arrangement all by themselves or randomly. There needs to be some designer to take those parts, put them together, and get them in the right arrangement. That's why the car has its arrangement. All right? There was someone who wanted to be able to have this system to allow them to drive from point A to point B. And they used their knowledge about physics, etc., to take these bits and pieces and put them in those places that they needed to be to achieve that function. And so similarly, insofar as we see organisms are well adapted towards their environment, for instance, and are able to achieve certain functions that allow them to survive and to accomplish various kinds of goals, we should think that the parts of those organisms, or the human eye, or the human heart, or the parts of the cell of a plant for the purpose of photosynthesis, gathering energy from the sun, we should think that those parts, there was some intelligence that understood those parts, that had this goal of having the heart pump blood, and use their power to put all those pieces in exactly the arrangement that they needed to be to achieve that function. And so the idea is, since those systems can only be produced by an intelligent designer, well, those organisms, those elements of the natural world, are the product of an intelligent designer. Like, it wasn't us that created the natural world, and so the idea is it must be God to be that intelligent designer. Now, there's a number of worries that we can raise for Paley's argument as well. The first version is that second premise claims that the only explanation for teleological systems that we see in nature would be an intelligent designer. But is it really true that that's the only explanation that there could possibly be? Look, some things happen by chance. And so even if you think it's unlikely, isn't it possible that those systems became arranged by, randomly into that order? Now, insofar as you think, yeah, okay, I'm willing to accept the possibility of chance or randomness producing these highly organized systems, but you think it's not really plausible, and so we shouldn't really believe that it came about by chance, at that point, that might suggest that we ought to adopt a different version of Paley's argument that's actually going to lead to the kind of reasoning that's going to be best for understanding the fine-tuning argument. But similarly, someone might argue, well, look, instead of just chance, there could also just be natural principles by which matter becomes organized. I think this was essentially Hume's criticism of the design argument, using the example of the oak tree and the acorn. Look, an oak tree is a teleological system. Now, where does it come from? It develops from an acorn. An acorn is not an intelligent system. An acorn is just a hunk of matter. But it's a hunk of matter upon which there are these natural principles by which the acorn naturally develops into the oak tree. And so the idea is perhaps teleological systems in nature are like that. There's simply matter in the world, and then there's natural principles that by their very nature organize matter into these organized systems. At this point, Paley says, yeah, you can say that there could be these natural principles, but until you can actually give examples, we have no examples of the mechanisms by which nature could produce them. And so at this point, it looks like the better explanation is intelligent design. We understand how intelligence can serve as an explanation, can explain teleological systems, but we don't have any examples of natural principles by which this organization would happen. However, at this point, you might think that Paley's reasoning implicitly commits what's called an appeal to ignorance. Something like, we don't understand how this can happen. Oh, so I guess God did it. But look, the fact that we are ignorant of any natural explanation of something happening doesn't mean that there isn't a natural explanation of that phenomena. Again, just think about magicians. When you see a magician do something, you can't explain how they were able to do something. You don't thereby jump to the conclusion that God did it or that it was really magic. Just because you don't know the natural explanation doesn't mean that there isn't one. Another kind of criticism says, look, even if this argument is successful and gives us reason to believe that there's some kind of intelligent design behind nature, that wouldn't thereby imply the traditional conception of God. Again, why should we think that that intelligence is all-knowing or all-powerful or all-good? Why should we think that there's just one designer, like monotheism rather than polytheism? And related to that, what about this problem of non-optimal design? When you look at nature, yes, things seem to be well designed for certain functions, but they don't seem to be designed as optimally as they could. If you study some biology, you very quickly learn about animals and creatures that could have been designed better for fulfilling certain purposes or functions. So just as a quick example, the laryngeal nerve in mammals, there's a nerve that goes from essentially the brain to the larynx, and it's very, very delicate. If it was damaged, that'd be very bad for the organisms. And so if you were going to design like a creature from scratch, like optimally, the best way to design that would be to make the nerve take a straight path directly from the brain to the larynx, essentially. But that's not what we actually see. The nerve actually comes down, our neck goes around and wraps back up and goes back up there. And that's true even in giraffes. It goes down all that very long neck, then goes all the way back up. That doesn't seem to be the most optimal design. And I can give you lots of other examples as well. But the idea here is, if there were a perfect designer, wouldn't you expect perfect design? So this isn't to say that there isn't really good design in nature, but it does seem to be the case that it's not designed as optimally as it could be. Then lastly, the real critical blow to Paley's argument was, I mentioned that the idea of those natural principles, well, what could those natural principles be? Well, Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection introduced an actual theory about what those natural mechanisms could be. All right, and when we combine that with the modern story of Mendelian genetics, all right, we can explain how through random mutations and then millions of years of natural selection, so organisms would get arranged in such a way that they would be well adapted for various functions and purposes, and thereby explain the organization we see in nature without appeal to any kind of intelligence guiding it. And we have lots of evidence in favor of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. And so someone might say, maybe during Paley's time, before Darwin was around, maybe the observation of design in nature gave us good reason to believe in maybe an intelligence like God. But now that we have an alternative explanation, a purely natural explanation with lots of historical evidence behind it, the design argument no longer has the same impact that it used to. But now, because of this, some people have stopped looking at organisms and started to go back to that original idea of the universe itself seeming to be like a machine in various ways. So to set this up, I want to start with an example. Let's just imagine that you and me are playing a game. All right, it's a very simple game. I'm going to roll a 6-sided dice. All right, it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 on each side. And if I roll a 4 through 6, then you need to pay me $10. And if I roll a 1 through 3, then I need to pay you $10. All right, so I take the dice and I roll it. Oh, and it came up a 5. Okay, you're like, dang it, I lost. I mean, but look, it was 50-50. I was playing with chance, and so we play again. I roll it. It's a 6. You're like, yeah, you won again? I mean, that happens. All right, well, let's keep playing. I roll it a 3rd time. I get a 5. I win again. Roll it a 4th time. 4. I win again. 5th time. 6. I win again. And now imagine I keep doing this over and over and over, and I keep winning and winning and winning, so much so that we get to the 1,527th roll, and it's a 5 again. It's never been a 1 through 3. You likely wouldn't be willing to chalk that up to chance. Like the 1st and 2nd roll, 3rd roll, you might be like, I guess I'm just having bad luck. You would explain that sequence of outcomes as just a product of chance. But when you get to this 1,527th roll, this is just so surprising that you would surely start to get suspicious that something else is going on. Something besides chance is going on here. I'm cheating in some way, or the dice is rigged in some way. So this leads into what you might call abductive reasoning. All right, so abduction, remember, inference to the best explanation, says there's some surprising fact that we've observed. Well, now, what would explain that fact? Since it's surprising, we need some explanation, and it looks like our best explanation is E. And so probably E is true. All right, so there's this surprising fact that there were over 1,500 rolls that were all 4 through 6. One explanation of that is that it was just random chance. But that just seems so incredibly unlikely. It doesn't seem like a very good explanation. A better explanation is that the dice is rigged and Sam is cheating. All right, so you might think probably something else is going on here. Sam's rigged the dice. This is the kind of reasoning that I think best introduces this kind of fine-tuning argument. And you might even think Paley is probably best understood as giving an abductive argument. There's this surprising fact. We see these teleological systems. We see this design in nature. And Paley thought the best explanation was that there was an intelligent designer. Well, now we have an alternative explanation, theory of evolution by natural selection, and you might think that this now is maybe the best explanation that we have of the design we see in organisms, their adaptation to their environments. But now there's another surprising fact besides just organisms' adaptation to their environments that we've observed within science these days. And now I'm going to give some quotes pretty much in full from some of the readings here to explain. So it's fortunate for us that the physical constants, such as the strength of gravity, have the values they do. Similarly, there are laws of nature that appear to be necessary for our existence. And a third example is the universe's initial conditions. Some philosophers and scientists estimate that some of the constants couldn't have varied by more than 1 part in 10 to the 60th power. So this is a 1 with 60 zeros after it in this denominator, and still permitted life. All right, so had they just been ever so slightly different than what they are, like the law of gravity, all right, those values, if the gravity had been slightly more powerful, then life could have never developed within our universe. So this is from the 1,000-word philosophy article that we read for this unit. Similarly, Philip Goff in his article says, one of the most fascinating developments of modern science is the surprising discovery of recent decades that the laws of physics are fine-tuned for life. This means that for life to be possible, certain numbers in physics had to fall within an incredibly narrow range. Perhaps the most striking case is that of the cosmological constant, the number that measures the force that powers the accelerating expansion of the universe. This cosmological constant is an odd number. It's extremely small, but non-zero. If the cosmological constant were just ever so slightly bigger, everything would have been spread apart so rapidly that no two particles would have ever met, and so you and I would have never existed. But on the other hand, if the cosmological constant was less than 0, it would have added to gravity, meaning that the entire universe at the Big Bang would have started expanding but then it would have collapsed on itself within a split second. So for life to be possible, for it to be possible for you and me to exist, that number had to be in this strange, very precise, specific category that it has, extremely close to zero without crossing over into the negative. All right. So notice here, the fine-tuning, we're not looking at how organisms are designed and well adapted to their environments for certain functions. We're looking at how the laws of nature and the principles guiding our universe had to have very specific values in order to allow for life or organisms in the first place. So this is the idea of the fine-tuning of our universe. This is what we observe. There's this fact that the physical constants, the laws of nature, and the initial conditions of the universe have the exact values that seem to be necessary for allowing life to develop within our universe. And now we can get to this abductive version of the fine-tuning argument. The idea is we've made this surprising observation that our universe seems to be fine-tuned for the existence of life. But given how surprising that is, it looks like we need some explanation for why those values are exactly what they are. And it looks like the traditional theistic God is the best explanation for that fine-tuning, for why they have those values. Right? That is, God set the dials exactly where they needed to be in order for God to allow life to develop. And so probably, since this is the best explanation we have, that traditional theistic God exists. Now, you may have noticed that the 1,000-word philosophy article that I signed for this week gave a slightly different reconstruction of the argument. It said, if God does not exist, so if atheism is true, then it was extremely unlikely that the universe would permit life. But if God does exist, then it was actually rather likely that the universe would permit life, since God would be there, would want to allow for life, and so would thereby set the dials and would have the power to do so. Right? Therefore, the fact that the universe permits life is strong evidence that God exists. Right. I want to suggest that the best way to pitch this is that this is an argument meant to defend the premise about why the traditional theist has the best explanation for fine-tuning. The first premise is explain why chance is not a good explanation for fine-tuning. That is, if atheism were true, if God does not exist, then it looks like the fine-tuning would just be a product of chance, randomness. But given all the possible different ways that the initial conditions could have been instead, given all the values that the law of gravity could have had instead, the cosmological constant could have had instead, the idea is it looks incredibly unlikely that those values would have had those precise values. All right. And so given that it's so unlikely, chalking it up to chance is just not a very good explanation. It's like chalking up my rolling 1,526 rolls where I win on that dice up to chance. It's so unlikely for that to happen randomly that chance is not a good explanation of that observation. But on the other hand, since if God were to exist, it would be really likely for these values to have the values they need to be in order to allow for life, right? It looks like traditional theism is a much better explanation. So when we go back to this argument, the way the 1,000-word philosophy article has developed their version is essentially just a way of trying to support this second claim, that the traditional theistic God is the better explanation. But now notice all of this, even if the argument is cogent, all right, so even if its premises are true, and even if it does make its conclusion probable on its own, it wouldn't prove that God exists, and it wouldn't prove that the belief in God is justified. Because for that, we need to take into account all the other evidence for or against the existence of God. So the idea is, well, this might be the best explanation of fine-tuning that we have. There might be other factors, there might be other evidence out there that might speak against the existence of God, and so we would have to balance those against one another. And maybe when we balance those out, maybe like the problem of evil, maybe that would override the evidence in favor of God that comes from fine-tuning. So that's all for this presentation. In the next one, we'll be looking at some of the problems for the fine-tuning argument. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.